Good afternoon and welcome to today's Schemel Forum Luncheon, generously sponsored by Munley Law. My name is George Alicio and I have the privilege of directing the Schemel Forum. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to thank the people that make this program possible. First and foremost, thank you to Munley Law for their sponsorship of the program, to our members who are loyal to us, and to our a la carte attendees today. All of you are the reason that this program is made possible, so please give yourselves a round of applause. Thank you so much. One piece of housekeeping. This is a very large room and we are recording, and I know many of you have heard me say this before, but when we do the Q&A, please wait for the microphone to get to you or nobody will be able to hear what you're saying. Rose will be running around with the microphone and I also will be running around with the microphone today, so please wait for the microphone. Okay, now it's my pleasure to introduce Jill Dougherty, a journalist, scholar, and longtime friend of the Schemel Forum. Jill is someone we will always welcome back with open arms, not because she fills the seats, which clearly she does, but because her insights are so important for us all to hear. Today, Jill's here to talk about her deeply personal and timely book, My Russia, What I Saw Inside the Kremlin. Jill spent decades covering Russia at some of the most pivotal moments in recent history, from the final years of the Soviet Union to the rise of Vladimir Putin and the current war in Ukraine. As a former CNN Moscow bureau chief and an expert in Russian affairs, she has reported from the White House, the State Department, and on the ground in Moscow, offering firsthand insights into the complex relationship between Russia and the West. At a time when global attention is fixed on Russia's role in reshaping the geopolitical order, Jill's perspective is especially timely. Today's talk will help us better understand the forces driving Russia's internal politics, its leadership, and its international ambitions, providing essential context for anyone trying to make sense of this moment. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Jill Dougherty.
Thank you, George. I just wanted to say I'm really very touched to be here. I'm excited to be here, but I'm really touched because this is where my life, doing what I do, Russia, following everything that goes on in that part of the world, my career, it all came because of being in high school a million years ago with Michael Peregrine, who was my Russian teacher. And his son is here today. And I have to say, really, thank you to your father for giving me my career. And as I talk today, I have a couple of slideshows that I prepared. They're very short, but they have some, I think, meaningful pictures. And I'll, yammer on for like about 35 minutes or so. And then I'd love to open it up to questions because I think this is either good or bad, happily or sadly. This is a very topical conversation. Russia, Ukraine, relationship of the United States with Russia, et cetera. So I'm pretty sure there are a lot of questions. And the other thing, before I forget, I wanted to thank you very much to Amy for bringing her fantastic Russian students because, that I was your age when I started studying Russian, and it changed my life. I mean, literally changed my life. So I hope you have good studies. I hope you enjoy it. And I hope you go on and continue to study Russian. So without further ado, I will call up these slideshows that I have. There we go. Okay, so this is kind of more the personal one. So this book that I wrote, it took me about 40 years to write that book. I've been a journalist all my life for even more than 40 years, and I never wrote a book. And I've written everything else. I've done radio, print, TV, primarily TV. But there is a big difference between doing like a 1 or 2 minute script, for a little voiceover for TV and writing a book that's over 300 pages long. And a friend of mine, when I thought about it, I thought, this is now going back maybe 7, 8 years, and I talked to this friend who's a very big Russia expert, and I said, I want to write this book, and I think I'll do a Putin book. I think I should. And he said, Jill, we don't need another Putin book. There are plenty of good Putin books, which is really true. Plenty of good Putin books. I can recommend Putin books. But he said, what you should write is a personal book about your involvement in Russia. Because, and I actually did not think about this in the way that maybe I should have, that the experience that I had at the particular time that I was born and meeting Mr. Peregrine and studying Russian and the Cold War was all serendipitous, but it all was kind of unique because I studied it and then I went on and I really used it. So I think his advice was really good. And I began to kind of collect material. And Michael, I don't know whether you know this, exactly the timing on this, but when, this is a few years ago, I thought I should talk to Mr. Peregrine because the things that are in my head, you know, the memories, I don't know, are they right? Do I remember them correctly? You know, because over years, things change. And so I said, could I come by? And I sat down in the kitchen with Mr. Peregrine and Pat, his wife, your mother, and did this interview. And sadly, Mr. Peregrine died about a year later. So all of that would have been lost. And Mr. Peregrine had his own history, a lot of which is in this book, because I find it, you know, Scranton, ethnic groups that came to the mines, to work in the mines, late 1800s, early 1900s, actually mid 1800s, and then into the 20th century. Ukrainians, Russians, Lithuanians. I grew up in neighborhoods with people from those regions, Baltic regions, et cetera. So it was all very real to me. And when I started kind of researching and thinking about his history, it was very touching because he went back to Russia to learn to teach Russian. He spoke Russian, but he went back to Russia as the first member of his family for like 100 years or whatever. He goes back to Russia and told me about it. So I'm going to begin with this short, little slideshow. So this is Mr. Peregrine, and this is literally a picture. It's a selfie that I took when I did the interview with Mr. Peregrine in his kitchen. And, you know, he told me he was actually a very funny person. I don't think he knew how funny he was, really. But he told me all about his life and his family's life. And then this is, I'm almost embarrassed to show, but this was big news. We had moved by that time to Worcester, Massachusetts, and this is big news in the Worcester Telegram that Pam and I should mention, my twin sister, we both did the same thing, studied Russian together, and then went to Leningrad State University. And so that was a report in the paper, you know, twins to study in Russian, but in Russia. But it was unique, I must say. And I thank my parents because, go back. Like, we studied Russian beginning in 1963 to 1967. And then we went to Leningrad State University in 1969. And I think a lot of parents at the time probably would have said, big bad Soviet Union, my kids aren't going there, you know, but my parents welcomed it. And they're the other, people that I'm really grateful to because they took a chance and they supported studying this crazy language and then going to the Soviet Union at a time that was, the dark Cold War. So there we were then. Here we are. In those days, or at least for that program, which was part of a cultural exchange with the Soviet Union. And here we are on a ship. This is my mother on the left, my little sister, Pam and I, and we're in New York, and we're about to set sail with several hundred other students who were going to Europe to study. And then there was a group of us who went on to take a plane into Leningrad. So it was very funny because they said on the boat, they said, if you bring marijuana into Europe, you're really going to get us in trouble. So you'd better smoke up everything you have on this ship because you're not going to take it into France. So I did not smoke marijuana. I was like, I hate to say, kind of a nerdy kid. I loved Russian. I didn't smoke, I didn't drink, I didn't date, I didn't do anything. I just studied Russian, and Pam and I would study together, and I enjoyed it. I was happy. So anyway, this is the first picture, one of the first pictures that I took in Russia with a camera, a Leica Flex for those who are camera lovers, beautiful camera that my uncle, who was a photographer, gave me. And this is the big bad Soviet Union. This is Leningrad, Palace Square, and I really loved the picture. I later almost wanted to become a photographer later as I started doing more. But it says, "Long live the great indestructible unity of the party and the people." And this was, Lenin. So, and why I loved it was Lenin kind of walking on the heads of the people. And this is, just look at, this is a gigantic building. This is not, you can see it's really very big. Full picture of him, the flags of the different republics. And now, of course, all of those 15 different republics of the Soviet Union are independent countries, including Ukraine. And other, which we will get into. So this, it was really fantastic experience. Lived in a dorm with Russian, actually Ukrainian roommates, and ran out of hot water. Went to the banya. Does anyone know what the banya? Yeah, banya, the public baths, and had a very Russian experience in those days. Now this is our class. And this is one of the very few pictures that we actually have of that period. So the man at the bottom was one of our teachers, Robert Eduardovich, and he was fantastic. They were really, really dedicated teachers. The girl to the right, that's Pam. I'm in the middle. My two friends, that was Russ Burford, one of my great friends, another guy, Rich. And this, I'm embarrassed to say, I do not remember her name, but the pressure was so strong in those days that you can kind of see the circles under her eyes. She had to leave. She actually left the program because she just couldn't take cold, snow, constant, communist propaganda, crapola, and pressure, just the pressure of being in the country, the constant harping, capitalist America, oppressing the workers. And she finally actually left. So the rest of us stayed. I think we were kind of insane, but we liked it. That is one of my best Russian friends. Boy, this is crazy. The next one won't be as crazy. Sergei. So he's in the book. Tanya and Sergei became my best friends. And just shorthand, I think what I learned from them, roughly our age, they got married, they had a baby right around the time we were there. And I think what I learned from them was Tanya and Sergei, as many Soviet people of the time, could never say what they wanted to say, read what they wanted to read, or do what they wanted to do. They couldn't even, go to other countries. And so they lived their lives in this little room in a communal apartment. It was a communal apartment building in Leningrad. And after World War II, so much of Russia was destroyed, and people lived the housing was terrible. So they lived in a room that was truly like from here to maybe the middle of that table and a little bit wider. It was living, sleeping. They shared a communal kitchen with other families. They had no shower, and they had one toilet. It was pretty primitive. So they taught me kind of the desperation, the quiet desperation of those days where people would go into their kitchens, and they were the only people that they could trust in these kitchen conversations. So he was really important to me. That's a picture. A Soviet sent that to me. I later worked for the Voice of America, and and broadcast in Russian to the Soviet Union. This is Pam. So as I begin the book, I'll just give you an idea. Structure is, I begin February 2022, February 24th, 2022. Does that ring a bell to anyone in the room, that date? Pardon? Correct. Full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So CNN, I had left CNN after 30 years in 2014. But I continue to work for CNN as a commentator, what they call contributor, on Russia issues. So they said, we think that we know and believe the US government that Russia is going to invade Ukraine. Can you get to Moscow? So that's where the book begins, with the Russians saying, invasion? What invasion? We never invade anybody. They invade us. We're always the victims. What are you talking about? That's ridiculous. That was, I mean, it was like, 24-hour propaganda, no invasion, figment of your imaginations. And then, of course, on the 24th, they invaded. So I begin with the description of being at the CNN bureau during that invasion, which was really it was a really incredible experience because you could see propaganda. I also teach I teach at Georgetown, and I teach a course there are two. One is called The Putin Generation. So it's people like your age who've grown up with no leader other than Vladimir Putin. And I teach a course on propaganda. And there was like master class in propaganda on Russian TV. Again, no invasion, never heard of it. And then, yes, the president of Ukraine is a Nazi, even though he's Jewish. It was pretty crazy. But anyway, so it begins there. Then it goes back in time to Scranton Central High School, exchange students, exhibits, which this photograph is taken from an exhibit. Now, the US Information Agency, which then became part of the State Department and now no longer exists. I think it should exist, actually, that's my viewpoint. But they had exhibits in the Soviet Union. So these exhibits would show life in the United States. And this one was called Pam, this is Pam right there. And we were all, young guides, like 20 years old, with our spiel about whatever exhibit part we were on. So she was out with the Apollo space capsule, the real thing. And, Russians were really interested in that. And we had cars, and we had a robotic arm from the space program. And, so Russians were interested in the exhibits, but they were also interested in life in the United States. And that's where I think the next picture, that's me on the stand. And they would just come and ask questions all day long about life, a lot of things about racial issues in the United States. Vietnam, why are you invading, Vietnam? It was difficult. It was really, complicated. And then I began my career with CNN. I'm sure you can recognize Boris Yeltsin. Just apropos of that picture, this is the first time I ever met him in person. And I had just pretty much gotten to Moscow as the CNN bureau chief. And I thought, I want to ask him a question that will stand the test of time, that won't be like dated a day from now. So I thought, what can I ask? And I thought, I'll ask him about his legacy. What do you want as your legacy? So I said, Mr. President, and I'm speaking, of course, doing this in Russian. And I said, Boris Nikolaevich, can you tell me what in the future, when you are no longer with us, what will be your legacy? And he went like this, I'm not dead yet. And he's like, he was a gigantic guy. I mean, he was like a football player. And I thought, oh, I'm out of here. But he was very nice to, shake my hand after that insulting question. And then Gorbachev, I have to say, before Putin, Gorbachev, I am a fan of Gorbachev. Gorbachev was important because now we're at the end of the Soviet Union. He brought about the end of the Soviet Union. And he did it because he wanted to, let's say, reform the Soviet Union, but continue it. So economic reform, but the USSR continues. And unfortunately, the system, the economic system, didn't work. So he, by bringing in these reforms, he actually destroyed the Soviet Union, even though he did not want to. I mean, that's shorthand for what happened. So he is excoriated by Russians. A lot of Russians hate him, and they blame him for ending the Soviet Union. So that's another subject that maybe we can talk about, the end of the Soviet Union. Putin is a different matter. Love to talk, any questions that you have about him. He is I think the bottom line is he is still a KGB agent. And the old phrase goes, there's no such thing as an ex-KGB guy. You know, I mean, in other words, you're one for the rest of your life. It's a different mentality, you know. No trust of the West, certainly. Chip on your shoulder. And I think he's a tough character, right? This little picture that I took of him, he almost looks sweet, don't you think? But he, you know, he's everything to everybody. Like, if you were to meet him and you were an educated, normal, nice person, he will be educated, nice, and normal back to you. Because his method is to get you to like and trust him so that he can use you and recruit you to do what he wants, okay? Now, if you're a tough guy and you use profanity, he'll get down in the dirt with you too, and he'll do the very same thing. So it's fascinating to me to watch what he's trying to do with President Trump, you know? Like, obviously he has all the information about Trump that he possibly could have. KGB, you know, they do psychological studies. Trump was in Russia back in 1987, so they have a lot of material. And Putin studies up and finds out, you know, everything that you can do to manipulate the other guy. So kind of an interesting modus operandi. I left the White House. That was, this is Putin again. So this is Putin at the first interview that I ever took part in. These were American journalists, and we were at the Kremlin. And another experience of being like right next to him and getting the vibes. You know, it's another thing it's one thing to see him in a big crowd or do a press conference, but I was literally sitting next to him. And I do have my ideas, maybe correct, maybe not, about what makes him tick. This actually is important. This is a letter. When I left Russia and came back to the United States, Putin sent me a gift, and he sent me a tea set. And it was actually very nice, so like 2 cups and a tea pot and a coffee pot. And on those pots were depictions of the bridges in St. Petersburg, Leningrad. For those of you who visited Leningrad, you probably saw beautiful bridges. And the person who brought it, who is his press guy, said, this is from the president. I said, oh my goodness, thank you so much. You know, I studied at Leningrad State University. And he looked at me and he said, we know. Yeah, it's like, we know your shoe size. We know what your little sister ate in 1950. I mean, you know, they know everything. So it was kind of idiotic. But he wrote a letter, and when I think of it, it was very complimentary. You know, thank you for your many years of fruitful work in Moscow and for your respect and love of the Russian people. And I thought, you know, I walk by that, and I have it in my apartment. And when I look at that, I think that could never happen today. You know, I mean, now, as of the beginning of the presidency of Trump, they're being nice to Americans, kind of saying, you know, well, we can work together. But up until that time, and still on Russian TV, it's satanic West, literally satanic West, as in the devil, like possessed by the devil, that we are corrupt, debauched, terrible people, and that we want to take over Russia. So I look at that letter and always think, what could have happened? What could have happened? But it didn't. So there we are, the reality of the situation. And this last picture. This is, I told you, the full-scale invasion, February 24th. So then we, meaning the CNN team, were there for several days. And on March 5th, the Duma, which is their parliament, passed a law. And the law said, you can't call the war a war. You may have heard about this. You can't use the word war. You can't say anything about the war or report on it. He called it special military operation. That's the word you have to use. And you can only use information that you get from the military. You can't use anything else. So CNN, we just decided there's no way that you can report without calling it a war. And we're not going to take just the word of their military. So the lawyers actually looked at that law. The CNN lawyers looked at the law and said, basically, you could be arrested for anything. And it was 15 years in prison for saying the word war at that point. So we had to pull out. So on March 6th of 2022, we left. And that night, I haven't been back since, and I sadly don't intend to for a long while, but I walked through the bureau, and this is a picture, a selfie that I took. It was like midnight. I was leaving the next morning, and I walked through the CNN bureau, and that's the carpeting. I was in charge of the bureau. I ordered that carpeting and had them, put CNN on the floor. It was the place where I'd lived and slept and ate, for years, for almost 10 years I worked there. And it was very painful to leave. And so I have to say, personally, I to this day, find it very disturbing that I don't feel that as an American, I could go back and not risk arrest. Because right now, they're, holding Americans. Like, remember Brittany Griner, the basketball player, and then other people have been freed since. And, there's no guarantee that you will not be arrested. So I just wanted to go, this one will work better, I guarantee. This is a very quick slideshow. And let's hope that it works. I believe it will. Okay, yeah, this I think will be better. So I put this together. I'll just talk maybe 5 minutes on this and then open it to questions. I always talk longer than I expected, but it's something I'm very interested in. So Putin, there's a big debate. Does he have, that's baby Putin as a young man. So the debate is there Putinism? Is there an ideology? And if there is, what is it? And will it survive Putin? And I find it a fascinating question because in the Soviet Union, they had Marxism-Leninism, right? And that was the official ideology. When the Soviet Union collapsed, in their constitution, they said, no more ideology. You cannot have ideology. So at the same time, Russians were trying to figure out, now that communism is gone, country's completely different, who are we? It's like in America, it's, we're Americans, everybody's equal, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, that type of thing. Russians were all saying, who the heck are we? Because the country had fallen apart. All these 15 republics are now independent countries. And what is Russia? Who are we? What do we believe? And I believe that idea, that burning idea of like, who the heck are we, is something that Putin has tried to answer by putting together, I'm not going to say an ideology written out in a book, as Marxism-Leninism is, but it's an ideology of kind of how he looks at the world and he thinks of the role of Russia in the world. So this is just a quick little slideshow of Putin. Here he is, probably, 12, maybe 12, 13. he decided he wanted to become a KGB officer very early. And this is Leningrad, beautiful city, as I'm sure people who visited know. But it has, and this is, by the way, very close to, we studied like right there. So it was in the midst of this incredible architecture and history. But it does have, the city has another side to it. I mean, just look at this. It's like a movie set. But it has kind of a different side to it, kind of a darker side. There was a mafia in Leningrad. They've always been known for kind of like high culture and then pretty tough guys. So Putin grows up in this tough environment. Here he is as a little kid with his mother. Mother almost died in World War II, almost starved to death, because as some of you may remember or have read about, Leningrad was blockaded during the war by the Nazis for 900 days, and about 800,000 people died. And most of them starved to death or froze to death. And his mother was almost, he tells the story, that she was almost carted off because they thought she was dead. She had collapsed from hunger. So he went through, a real Soviet life. So after I left CNN, I said, let's go where and do a quick little bio of Putin in Leningrad. So we went back, and these are the pictures that I took. This is the building where he grew up. Old part of town, once an elegant building owned by a rich Russian woman, and then broken up into little tiny apartments that I described. And Putin lived in one of those little tiny apartments. So you enter it through this dark corridor, you'll see in a second, kind of go down this corridor into an inner courtyard, and you look up, and this is, I still don't know which apartment was his, but it was another one of these one-bedroom, Leningrad apartments. He has said that he beat off rats with a stick. And, having been there, it looks like you could beat off rats with a stick. It was pretty grim. So that's where he grew up. And this is some of the destruction during World War II, massive destruction. And I think that affected Putin, kind of like, never again on my watch will I let this happen. Then, kind of an amazing thing, stop on this definitely. So that picture that just kind of went by is a big cemetery that we visited. And I have more pictures of it in a second. So people are starving to death. This is the ration for your daily ration, that piece of bread. But by the end of 900 days, it wasn't even bread. It was wallpaper paste, whatever, cellulose, whatever they could get together, sometimes grass. And that is what you ate. So that's why so many people died. So I think this is, again, I am not making excuses for Vladimir Putin, but I am saying that put it in context. I think he feels that Russia is going to be attacked, and everybody out there wishes Russia ill. The Nazis invaded us, and I'm not going to let that happen. So here we are at the cemetery, very solemn place, where people were literally, I'll stop on this one, people were carted off, bodies were carted off to common graves and just buried in these mounds, like the grass that goes up like that. They were just kind of put into common graves. And it turns out, after we visited that cemetery, about a year later, they found that what would have been Vladimir Putin's older brother, who was like 3 at the time, Putin was born right after the war. His brother was born during the war, and he died at the age of 3 from dysentery. And he's buried there. He was just the poor little kid. They don't even know. His body was put into that cemetery. So again, back to Putin, KGB headquarters, Putin decides he wants to be a KGB agent, and they say, essentially, I always like to do this. They say, you want to be a KGB guy? Okay, you got to go to school. So he goes to the juridical faculty, which is law school, Leningrad State University, and he is at law school at the same time that Pam and I are at Leningrad State University, but we never met him, but he was there. Gets his law degree, and here he is, KGB agent, serves in Germany, and then this, I'll kind of end here because I, again, do want questions. I like this picture because if you want to put together like the Putin ideology, here it is. The middle, I don't know whether people recognize that, but that is a double-headed eagle of Imperial Russia, Tsarist Russia. So he takes, let's say he's making his soup, of ideology. He takes Imperial Russia, high culture, the Tsars, ancient Russian culture, Russian Orthodox Church, Orthodoxy, 1,000 years, all of that. And that's kind of the pride of Russia. Then he takes, anybody recognize this dude? Lenin, Vladimir Lenin. He doesn't say take communism, but he takes the Soviet Union in World War II, which has become, today is Victory Day, May 9th. Victory over fascism. You will see a lot of reports on TV, coincidentally, today. Putin has turned this into the world owes Russia for saving the world from the Nazis. So it's very big and part of his ideology. And then the last is the flag on the top, which essentially is, we too can be, these are some T-shirts of Putin and kind of myth. I think the last part of the ideology is we too can be a modern country. We too, like Mr. Medvedev, who took over for Putin for a few years as president, he went to Silicon Valley, he tweeted. So yeah, Russia can be a modern country too. And, it kind of pulls together as an ideology. It's very broad. It's what we would call the big tent, to let everybody in. Fascists, from left to right. And then finally, that's a good question might also be this nostalgia for the Soviet Union, which is happening right now, oddly enough. And then back to Moscow. So I'll just say, this is a protest that I went to, and Mr. Putin, who started it. I find him interesting and somehow, compelling, because on the one hand, he has done some good things for Russia, but I was too naive. I'm just going to stand here and tell you, I was too naive when I looked at him, probably because, I studied the Russian language and I was interested in the culture, and I forgave a lot, or actually didn't listen to the bad things he was saying. At one moment, like in the beginning, he was saying, we believe in freedom of speech, et cetera. And then he immediately went for the journalists and took over journalism. So these things that now, I think, not only Ukraine, which is being attacked brutally, but Russia itself is suffering from what he has decided to do. And it is really kind of one man. His rule is very tight. He's got a small clique of people, a lot of them security people. And this is the man, as I write in my book, I end on Putin, actually, alone. Putin alone, because he is alone. He's the guy who wanted to control Russia, and he certainly does. But he is responsible for the things that are happening now. So I think I'll end on that. So many things. So another T-shirt, collector's item, save the world. But I think I'll end on that, and I'd love to get some questions. We've got about 15 minutes. And we have a microphone, but thank you very much. I hope you enjoy the book. I meant it as an easy read. It's, and I really do think it's not that hard, but there's a lot of history in it, and then there's a lot of personal story, and you know, my impressions of Russia, especially Putin, and ultimately, I would say my love for Russia still remains, but it is tinged with a lot of revulsion about what's happening. So thank you. Okay.
Does Russia think that it's in Europe?
That is also a good question. There is a debate. I mean, Russians think they're unique. Oh, did they turn it on? Oh, maybe I'll have to. I think it's because we can't use two mics. Let's see. Hello, hello, hello. Yeah, that's working. Okay, is Russia European? Big debate. Some people in Russia think it's not really fully European, so they use the word Eurasian. It certainly is a mixture of East and West, but I would argue that culturally it's quite European. But this Eurasian thing has become kind of another approach to the ideology. But the bottom line, they're unique. They are unique, and that's the end of it, just like Americans. Question over there?
Yes, I'm a little hard of hearing, so I'm
Yes,
sorry.
I'll speak up.
I'm hard of hearing, so I may have misunderstood. Did you say that while you were in Russia in 1987, President Trump did visit Russia?
Yes, President Trump, at that point a businessman, went to Russia in the late 80s. I think it was 87 for the first time. He was interested in building a hotel that never materialized, but he was in Russia. And I think, the Russians know him quite well, going back many years.
Okay, I had heard that at that time in the late 1980s, that the KGB was recruiting American businessmen.
Oh, they recruit everybody. I mean, they're there to spy. That's their job. That's what they get paid for. And, recruiting, it's interesting you should ask that, because you can recruit people to be KGB agents, like I'm going to recruit you as a spy. But you can also recruit what are called useful idiots. The Russians use that phrase, useful idiots. And these are people who are just, regular people, kind of like clueless, and they may spout things that are sheer Russian propaganda, but they don't know necessarily that they're doing that. So, you can, there's, I would say in the pecking order, there's kind of useful idiots are down here, and then you have agents of influence who may not be spies, and then you have spies. I mean, that's pretty much what it's like. Thank you. I just want to get some more questions, okay? If we could, because I know we're kind of short on time, but thank you very much. Good questions.
Hi, I don't know if you could answer this question, but I was just curious as to whether the average Russian citizen, whether they have a realistic concept of what kind of lives that the average American lives.
Yeah, is this working now? Can you hear me now? Oh, good, okay. Do the Russians have an idea of how we live? I think they pretty much do at this point. Because in the old days, when I was there, they were so cut off. There obviously no internet. You couldn't get papers from other countries. I mean, they really didn't know. They kind of felt it or, had that impression, but they didn't know. Today, they're on the internet. Before Putin kind of put the kibosh on it, Russians were traveling. Russians don't travel as much, so they kind of know. But I do have to say, that when Putin came in, gas prices were very high. And so his rule coincided with a great increase in the incomes of Russians. And, there were foreigners investing in Russia, et cetera. So, if you were to go to Moscow right now, it is a very cool, very nice city. It's very nice. And I lived there for 10 years. I can tell you, I really enjoyed it. But that is because they have money. There are billionaires in Russia. Because of the fall of the Soviet Union, they bought up a lot of the gas, oil, the infrastructure, let's say the economic infrastructure. But the country is doing better. So it's not like the Americans live much better than we do. It's not that. That was in the old days. But I will tell you one really important factoid that about the war right now. Some people, and maybe you'll ask, do people support the war? I'll tell you one reason why average Russians, some of them, quite a few, support the war. It's not that they support, killing all Ukrainians, although some actually do, shockingly. But if you go back to the old Soviet days, they had a very robust manufacturing, military manufacturing, military industrial complex. And those factories were cranking during the Cold War. Cold War is over, the factories close, and they shut down, kind of like the coal industry. If you think of it here, what happened to the coal industry? Okay, end of the Soviet Union, no more mines, but there it's no more factories. Putin, because of the war, needs tanks and shells and equipment and all sorts of military hardware. So those factories are back and booming. So the person who's living in a small town in Russia who lost their job 10 or 20 years ago, now they've got a job, now they're making money. And they may not particularly like the war, but they sure as heck like getting a salary. So some of them say, you know what, I'm for the war. I don't want to kill anyone, but I support the war. So I think you see what I'm talking about. That's a dynamic which explains in a really concrete way why some of the Russians would support the war. Yeah, another question? Yep, right.
Oh, it's over here first.
Oh, sorry.
Do you think Putin will demand, in order to settle the war with Ukraine, in terms of territory and what Ukraine might not be allowed to do according to Putin's position?
Yeah, that is a very big question right now. I think Putin will take whatever he can. Ideally, he would take all of Ukraine. He might say, well, it's still a sovereign country, although he doesn't really believe that it is a country. He literally does not believe it's a sovereign country. But I think what he would do is take over the country, get rid of Zelensky, either assassinate him or just have some type of forced election during the war and make sure that Zelensky is not elected president again. He would control the parliament. It would be very similar to what Putin does in a lot of countries. You just take over with corruption, buying off politicians, et cetera. So, but I truly believe he'll take as much as he can get. Now, with the negotiations right now, you have those areas that the Russians have taken in the eastern part and Crimea. I think that ultimately, there's no question, I think they would admit that Crimea is lost for the time being to the Russians, and that some of those areas of the Donbass coal mining area are probably controlled, but not totally controlled by Russians. Russians want more than they control. I think that's why Vance said they want too much. He just said that a couple of days ago, they want too much. That's what he means. So I think what could happen is ultimately they could say de facto Russia has those territories, but legally, de jure, they don't. And so you could finesse it that way. You could just say, we're going to get it back. kind of like what we did with the Baltics after World War II when they were taken over by the Soviets. We said, we don't recognize those countries, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. We do not recognize them as part of the Soviet Union, but practically, they are. Maybe that's what could happen. But the big debate, just quickly, big debate is what happens after Ukraine. Is that enough for Putin? Is that enough? Is anything enough? I mean, really, I think that's the question. Yeah. Yes. Oh, hi.
Hi, Jill. Does Putin think strategically or take strategic advice?
Ooh, well, that's kind of getting into psychology 101. Look, he's a smart guy. I mean, Putin is a smart person. I'm not going to say he's an intellectual, but he is a smart person. So is he strategic? I hate to kind of do this because so many people do this, but they go back to his judo. He is a master judo player? No, what do you say? Judo expert, black belt. So in judo, as has been explained to me, you can wait for the other guy to make a move, and then you respond. Okay, that's kind of what Putin does. He says something or does something, and then he waits, and he sees what the other guy does, and then he responds. So if he sees that there is weakness in the other guy, or he can intimidate in some fashion, he'll just drive right through, as far as he can go. So I don't think he's particularly strategic, and he can change his mind. He's changed his mind in a number of different cases. But with Ukraine, Ukraine is a very serious thing to him. He wants Ukraine, he thinks about it, he's written about it, and I don't think he's going to be satisfied until somehow he controls it. And the question is how will he control it? Yeah, hope that answers it. Yes, please, just a second, yeah. Sorry, Sandra, there's somebody in the back.
Me?
Yes, please.
Okay, about 10 or 15 years ago, I saw a special on television about Russia, and they talked about that younger generation, which would be maybe like 30 and younger, and
Yeah.
if they felt Putin was like a daddy to them. Is there any truth to that?
That's the course that I teach,
Oh,
and called the Putin generation. So the question is,
okay.
the Russians have done research on this. The textbook that I use was written by Russian sociologists who study people like you. For the last 25 years, they've been doing this. So are they different from their parents? And do they think of, Putin, as you said, as daddy? Okay, I think they are different from their parents because kids today are different from their parents in the sense of the internet. The internet has changed everything, and it has changed Russians and how they respond to the world. Now, the thing is, a lot of Russian young people live with their parents or their grandparents, in contrast to a lot of American kids. So they grow up with ideas that kind of predate them. Like a lot of young Russian people know about World War II, and I would presume that probably not a lot of you think about World War II. It's just not, doesn't mean anything particularly unless you're interested in history. But for them, it's like their grandmother might have died in the war, or Putin's mother almost died, that type of thing. So they're getting this generational thing. I would say, maybe we're almost out of time, I know, but there's a kind of a question that's connected to that, which is why do Russians, for the most part, support the war against Ukraine? So if you look at the polling, it's about 70% of the country, just generally, support the war. And you'd say, well, why would that be, because you're killing people. You invaded another country. And Ukraine is really important because a lot of Russians have relatives in Ukraine. I mean, really, so it's almost a joke, but so many Russians, their grandmothers live in Ukraine. So why would you do this? So the best that I can get, and I've talked with a lot of people about this, there is some polling. So if you took the Russian population, you would say roughly 20% are over here. So they're saying, my country, right or wrong, Ukrainians are ruled by fascists and Nazis. I think we ought to support Putin, and we ought to be even firmer, and just sock it to the Ukrainians, and we have the right to do that because they're not a country. Then you have another 20, maybe 18 to 20% over here who do not like Putin, who do not like the war. Some of them young. They went into the streets in 2022 and they were promptly arrested, or they were kicked out of school because they were protesting. So no protest today. It's the end of everything. If you protest on the street, you will be arrested and you will probably lose your job and your education. So that's the 20% over here do not support the war, do not support Putin, but they can't really do much about it, okay? Then that leaves 60% in the middle. So 60% in the middle, to me, are kind of like people around the world. They're looking at this war and they're saying, our guys are dying, our young guys are dying. The Ukrainians are dying too. I don't like war. I don't like death, etc. But, I can't do anything about it anyway. I'm just a simple person. I've literally heard interviews with people who say, I'm just one person, what can I do, And besides, maybe, I don't know, maybe NATO does want to invade us. But the other thing, and my students at Georgetown, I have several who have been Ukrainian, Russian, etc. Some of the Russian students have said, they call their family back, let's say in Moscow or St. Petersburg, and the family, and they're saying, oh my goodness, I can't believe the Russian forces are killing Ukrainians. And their relatives back in Moscow say, please, don't tell me about that. I cannot even deal with this. I don't believe that our guys are killing anybody. I think it's propaganda. And besides, it's so depressing, just leave me alone, And that leave me alone mentality is exactly what Putin wants, which is not to get too, esoteric here, but it's depoliticization of the Russians. It's making them think there's nothing you can do. Forget about joining with other people who are opposed to the war. Just sit there, go to your closet, hide, don't get involved civically. And I think that in any country right now, there are certain similarities. There are people in our country who don't believe, or just don't kind of say, well, things are happening, I don't know, I don't read the news. To me, civic activism and being involved in your society, like you are, you're at this forum because you're part of civil society. You believe in getting educated and probably acting on that, reading books, talking with your friends. And Russians are kind of the same, They should be involved too. And if all of them were, and they didn't have the repression that Putin has, it would be a better Russia. So I guess that's, maybe this, I don't know if this is the last question. I think we're running out of time. George, you tell me. But I would say my last pitch would be that people have to get involved. Because when they don't, you see what's going on in Russia. And you can see in other countries, United States, Europe, no matter where you look, people have to be involved, regardless of what your viewpoint is. If you have a viewpoint, get out there, and express it. And I think it's really crucial. So is that pretty much it, or are we okay? Thank you.